Okay, well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you in this virtual conference and to have the opportunity to deliver the keynote presentation for the first day of this virtual conference, which have titled Nighttime Driving Visual Challenges, Lighting Issues and Improving Safety. And this area of vision and nighttime driving has been a particular interest of ours for the last few years. So what I'll be doing is providing some context to the presentation, so talking about road safety at night, talking about some of the visual challenges of the nighttime driving environment, including how visual function changes under low light levels, as well as the impact of age and visual impairment. And then I'll be talking about some of the studies that we've done over the years, which have looked at nighttime driving in a range of different populations and using a range of different paradigms. So some of these have looked at the effect of a driver's vision, lighting and glare on nighttime driving performance. And we've also been particularly interested in improving the visibility of vulnerable road users at night, including pedestrians and cyclists. And so I'm looking forward at the end to having some questions, which I think you can submit through the chat function. So any areas that you'd like me to expand on or a particular question you have, please make sure you submit that so we can discuss that at the end. So to start off, I think most of you would probably agree that driving at night is dangerous, and this is supported by crash data, which shows that fatality rates at night are 3 times higher than in the day. And pedestrians are particularly vulnerable at night time because they're 7 times more likely to be involved in a fatal collision at night than in the day, and the crashes at night tend to be more severe than those in the day as well. And in terms of the factors that cause this increase in crash risk, poor visibility at night has been shown to be a key factor, particularly for those crashes involving pedestrians and cyclists and other low contrast obstacles. And this is to a greater extent than other factors such as fatigue and alcohol consumption on the part of the driver or indeed of the pedestrian or cyclist. And even the low levels of illumination that occur from a full moon can reduce pedestrian fatalities by 22% compared to those on a moonless night. So it seems that visibility really is important. And these problems of reduced visibility at night are exacerbated by the fact that drivers misjudge their own visual limitations at night, so that their confidence at night tends to be more based on lane keeping ability, which tends to be relatively unimpaired at night time, rather than the decrease in central vision that we're familiar with under low light levels. And this might contribute to the fact that drivers tend not to reduce their speeds at night. So typically drivers don't reduce their speeds at night. And if they do, it's not sufficient to compensate for the impairment in their performance. And it's interesting that there really aren't any specific nighttime driving standards, despite the fact that the visual demands of nighttime driving are very different to that in the day. And I'll go through that in the next few slides. And there are also limited tests that can assess visual function to capture some of those problems under low light conditions, including glare and low contrast. So in terms of vision and nighttime driving difficulties, around 1/3 of older adults report vision-related nighttime driving difficulties. And this in this figure from now and here on the right-hand side, this shows us the percentage of drivers self-restricting their nighttime driving, which is higher values, obviously more self-restriction as a function of age, and that's both for men and for women. And you can see as people age, they tend to restrict their driving more, from a range 20 to 50%, and that's particularly so for women. And even drivers with normal vision who are older tend to report problems with night driving, and these include the glare from oncoming headlights, halos and starbursts, as well as difficulty seeing lane markings. And in terms of visual function for nighttime driving, I think most of you will be aware that, in fact, nighttime driving isn't scotopic. It actually involves mesopic vision. So in terms of most nighttime roads are going to be illuminated by street lights to be around 1 to 2 candelas per meter squared for a well illuminated road, and between 0.1 and 1 candela per meter squared for rural roads. So really, when we're driving at night, we're sitting between the photopic and the scotopic range. And of course, when we're driving at night, we haven't just got the light from street lights, we've also got moonlight or starlight, but also our own headlights, as well as those of oncoming vehicles. And one of the issues is that we really don't understand much about how vision or light levels fluctuate as we drive at night. So we know the standards that are mandated by street lighting that we should be illuminating our roads at, but what we don't really well understand is some of those fluctuations in vision and glare that people encounter while they drive. So we did a study a year or so ago where we assessed the variations in light levels at the eye and also assessed pupil size whilst driving at night. And we had 9 young participants who drove a 16-kilometre route, which included expressways, high arterial traffic, as well as residential roads. And we had an eye tracker, which was able to measure pupil size continuously, as well as had an illuminance meter, which was attached here to measure the light levels at the eye. And what we found was is that there are really sharp increases from transient events such as oncoming headlights, traffic signals, or street lighting. So this is illumination at the eye for one participant, and this is showing us for arterial roads here in the sort of apricot color. Green is expressway and blue is residential. So you can see there's big differences and variations in light levels from moment to moment, with corresponding changes in pupil size as well. And in fact, we found that those changes in pupil size weren't really very well captured by pupil size measured in a clinical situation or a laboratory, and they were actually slightly better captured by mesopic level pupil size in the laboratory at about 1 candelas per meter squared. So what we're saying is really that the challenges at night time have got those fluctuations in light levels or fluctuations in pupil size, and this is occurring continuously regardless of the type of road that you're driving along. So in terms of mesopic visual function, there are some optical factors and neural factors that contribute to the changes in vision that occur under mesopic levels. So our pupil size dilates under mesopic levels, so our depth of focus gets worse. We've got more light scatter both from the cornea and the crystalline lens. And as well as we go into the mesopic levels, rods are contributing more to visual function, and therefore we've got poorer spatial and temporal processing. And as we age, of course, some of those changes are exacerbated. Our pupils do get smaller, so there's less light, but also we get increased cataracts or lens changes, so increased light scatter. And we also get a loss of photoreceptors and retinal cells, so our photopigment regeneration is more slow. And in this image here that I've got, it's just from some studies we've done last few years. You can see this is the change in pupil size under photopic levels between 50 and 80-year-olds, but there's a bigger decline in mesopic levels. And these combined optical and neurofactors reduce mesopic visual function. Older adults are particularly affected, but these impairments with increasing age are exacerbated in those with eye diseases. And these are the sort of eye diseases that are on our road system. So there are a lot of patients driving with cataracts. So cataracts are going to make a big difference to visual function. Got patients with glaucoma. So essentially a lot of people with glaucoma are still able to go through licensing because often their visual function centrally is pretty good, and visual fields have got to be quite extensive in terms of producing the sort of loss that we see on the estimand that in most countries defines visual standards for driving. And age-related macular degeneration, of course, central vision is affected, so they tend to be licensed out a bit earlier than those with glaucoma, but they still do complain a lot of nighttime driving. So in terms of visual function for nighttime driving, visual acuity, we know is very familiar to us in our clinical practice and in research, is the ability to detect small high contrast objects. But it isn't a good indicator of the quality of vision because it's giving us very limited information about real world environments. So small high contrast letters don't well capture the driving environment in general, but certainly don't do that at night. And in fact, visual acuity is reduced under mesopic conditions compared to photopic. It's shown here as a function of age. And these age-related declines in mesopic visual acuity occur 10 years earlier than for photopic VA. So the visual acuity under mesopic conditions of nighttime roads tends to be reduced to a greater extent in those who are older, who are having a lot of the problems at nighttime. Contrast sensitivity is a test that lots of people feel better represents the nighttime driving environment, because we're looking at the ability to see low contrast objects of different sizes, and there are many different tests available to assess contrast sensitivity. And of course, we know that mesopic contrast sensitivity can be impaired even if photopic contrast sensitivity is normal. So this is just showing us the change in mesopic contrast sensitivity as a function of age with a clinical test. And you can see when we do the same test under mesopic conditions, the decline is much greater with increasing age. And in fact, mesopic contrast sensitivity is associated with older drivers reporting that they avoid nighttime driving. And poorer mesopic contrast sensitivity in the presence and absence of glare has been linked to increased crash risk at night. So it seems like contrast sensitivity might be a test that's important for nighttime driving. Another test that typically people think about when they think of the problems for nighttime driving is glare. And there's good evidence to say that glare sensitivity increases with age, and that's both self-reported glare sensitivity as well as objective measures. Most of the tests to assess glare assess visual function in the presence and absence of glare, and they use different visual functions and different types of glares, but there aren't really many standardized testing protocols, which makes testing glare quite difficult and very difficult to compare across different studies. And this study just shows us the MESA test, which is a test that is part of the German standards, and this is the MESA test as a function of age with the absence of glare. It's actually shown here, and the presence of glare, and you can see in the presence of glare sensitivity decreases significantly. When you look at the self-reported glare difficulties, perceptions of disability and discomfort glare are very variable. People tend, or drivers tend, to overestimate the visual disability resulting from glare, but they also overestimate the distances at which they could identify targets and pedestrians in the presence of oncoming glare. So their perceptions of how glare is actually impacting on their function and potentially their vision for driving is quite inaccurate. Another test that we've been very interested in our lab is motion sensitivity and the link between motion sensitivity and driving. Discriminating moving hazards is important within the driving environment. So intuitively, we might think that motion sensitivity is important for driving. And under nighttime conditions or mesopic conditions, rod photoreceptors have poorer temporal processing characteristics. So velocity perception is degraded, and there's also a reduction in sensitivity to high velocity motion and the detection of biological motion. And we'll talk more about biological motion later on in the presentation. And in some of our studies where we looked at the capacity of drivers at night to detect pedestrians on a closed road circuit under nighttime driving conditions, we found that better motion sensitivity was related to increased pedestrian recognition distances. So those drivers whose motion sensitivity was better were able to detect pedestrians at the roadside sooner, and therefore would be able to avoid them more easily. And that was regardless of age. So motion sensitivity looks like it's really quite important for nighttime driving, and I'll discuss a bit of that later on in the presentation. So in terms of the types of approaches to assess driving performance, the literature is replete with lots of different studies on vision and driving, and some of those studies use crash data, some use simulators, and some studies use real-world driving performance, either on a closed road circuit, which we've done in a lot of our studies, as well as in traffic. But measuring nighttime driving is even more challenging, and it's interesting that very little crash data which relates to visual characteristics has actually portioned out nighttime compared to daytime crashes. So most studies that have looked at vision and crash risk have looked at crashes both under day and nighttime conditions, and haven't tended to isolate the effects of vision and nighttime crashes. And driving simulators, there are a number of problems with trying to simulate the nighttime driving conditions in terms of representing the light levels and contrast on oncoming glare. Each of those studies or each of those approaches does have a role, but for nighttime, it's actually quite challenging. So in the daytime, those different approaches are useful because there's quite a lot of data on crash data, driving simulators and real world driving under daytime conditions. But for nighttime, there's a very limited data set, partly because some of the challenges that I've just described in measuring nighttime driving using some of those approaches. And we have tended to measure driving performance under real nighttime conditions, on real road conditions, because we feel that that better represents the light levels and contrast that drivers encounter when they actually drive on nighttime roads. So the sort of way we have measured driving performance in many of the nighttime driving studies has been to use a closed road circuit, which is shown as an aerial view here and also as a schematic of some of the routes. And this is an actual image of part of the route. So it's not like a driving circuit, it's not a racetrack. It's actually a bitumen closed road circuit that's got standard road signs and markings and hills, bends and straight stretches. So it's quite bendy and hilly. And it's owned by our local transport authority, and we conduct both day and nighttime testing on that circuit. And I'm going to discuss some of the aspects of driving that we do capture on that road circuit. So essentially, we look at the ability to see different types of road signs, and I'm going to bring those in so you can see them. So it's a daytime because you can't see so much at night, but this is daytime signs. These are some low contrast hazards which are made of foam. So essentially if somebody drives over one of those hazards, it doesn't matter, it doesn't affect their steering, and we put these hazards in different positions on each route, so they're in unexpected positions. We look at manoeuvring and lane keeping, reaction times to detect targets as well as to detect pedestrians, and we'll talk a lot about pedestrian detection later on. And we also look at driving speed and overall composite scores. And essentially the advantages of using a closed road circuit like this is that we can actually manipulate task difficulty. So we can make the task more difficult, we can add distractors and the like because there are no other vehicles on the road. And we can also make the types of aspects of performance that we're looking at different. We can also assess simulated and true visual impairments. In many of our studies, we've simulated visual impairment and compared performance in the simulated condition compared to a non-simulated condition when somebody's driving around with normal vision. The disadvantage, of course, is that there aren't any other road users on the circuit, but for safety purposes, that really is a very big advantage for nighttime driving. And so I'm going to discuss some of the studies that we've done over the years, which have tried to look at some of the aspects of nighttime driving and looking at the link between vision and nighttime driving. So one of the studies we did a few years ago was to look at the effect of optical blur on daytime and nighttime driving performance, because we were interested to know whether blur had a greater effect in the day than under nighttime conditions. And we looked at some young visually normal participants who drove under different visual conditions. So they had some wide field goggles in which we either had the optimal distance correction, which was the control, or 3 blur conditions on top of their optimal distance correction. So we did half a diopter, and 2 diopters. And the order of these conditions was randomized, and people drove around the circuit 4 times under daytime and 4 times under nighttime, and we could compare the performance. And what we found was that driving performance was impaired with blur and nighttime conditions. And so I'm going to show you, this is just one figure from the paper. This is showing us overall driving Z score, which is a composite score of all of the different components of driving, where a higher value is better performance. And this shows us as a function of increasing blur. So this is the control, optimal correction, half a diopter, 1 diopter, and 2 diopter. So straight away you can see that daytime driving is always better than nighttime driving for the same tasks. But you can also see that for both day and nighttime, the effects of optical blur, even at half a diopter, reduce overall performance. But importantly, performance is worse at night in the day, and the effects of blur are exacerbated at night. So the separation between daytime and nighttime driving becomes much greater under the higher levels of blur. But even for low levels of blur, nighttime driving is impacted. In another study, we also looked at the effects of small levels of uncorrected astigmatism. So we wanted to really look at whether low levels of real uncorrected astigmatism, so in the previous study we simulated the effects of blur, but here we looked at people with low levels of astigmatism under a corrected with spherical contact lenses and also with toric contact lenses to see whether that made a difference to their driving performance. And we did it at night time because we know that's one of the times where it seems that blur is making more of a difference. So we looked at younger drivers who had between 3/4 to 1.25 diopters of astigmatism. They were all contact lens wearers. And we compared their nighttime driving performance under the uncorrected astigmatism, where they were wearing the optimal spherical contact lens compared to a toric correction. And we looked at pedestrian detection distances, sign recognition, low contrast hazard detection, and the like. And what we found was that, as you would probably expect, uncorrected astigmatism did reduce visual function, particularly for the mesopic measures. So this is visual acuity under photopic and mesopic conditions. And this is the spherical condition, and this is the same person for the toric condition. Of course, we randomized the order of the spherical and toric correction for participants for vision as well as for the driving. And this is a difference for photopic, so not much difference. But for the mesopic conditions, you can see there's a bigger deficit for the spherical correction compared to the toric. And for contrast sensitivity, similarly, you see a bigger deficit for the mesopic conditions. But interestingly, in terms of driving, we also found that uncorrected astigmatism did reduce nighttime driving performance. So this is some of those components I talked about. So this is the low contrast hazard detection, the percentage hit. So a higher value is worse because you're hitting more of the hazards. It's higher for spherical correction compared to toric. So wearing a toric correction actually reduces your ability to hit low contrast hazards, which is a good thing. And it also increased their pedestrian recognition distances compared to the spherical condition. And when we combined all the different driving measures together, you can see that overall driving performance was worse for the spherical correction compared to the toric, even though the levels of uncorrected astigmatism were relatively small. So in terms of other things that change at night, other factors that vary, not just the driver's optical correction or vision, road lighting at night, of course, is important. It's important to know how roads are lit at night. Of course, there are new street lighting technologies that are becoming available, including LED street lights and smart control systems, as well as new types of headlights, HID, and hazard detection and adaptive type of headlights. And the interesting thing is that we don't know that much about how these affect our vision and driving at night. And there are other sources of light at night, like advertising signs and billboards, which actually can cause distraction for drivers, and they often complain of the distraction and dazzle of some of those billboards. And lighting at night for street lights is really there to allow safe movement of traffic and other road users without causing glare to oncoming drivers. But the design principles of street lights is changing. As we go on, roads are becoming much more complex. They're busier, it's much more challenging. There's many more things to negotiate as we drive, and the visual attention demands of driving are becoming higher. We've got faster speeds of traffic, higher densities, and in the last few years, there's also been a big change in the way in which LED street lighting has been designed. And an interesting question, and this is the focus of this particular study that I'm going to discuss, is how we know that we can dim LED street lighting and we can make it more economic and it's more safe to the environment, because in terms of the energy consumption. An issue though is how much can we dim LED street lighting and still maintain safe roads? So as I said, road authorities are really interested in this because they would like to reduce their street lighting bills by reducing street light levels by dimming. We know that increases the economic cost of street lighting. We know the energy consumption is reduced, but what is not really well known is how dimming impacts on safety and how dim is dim enough but not too dim to incur unsafe driving. So in this study, this is a shot of the straight part of the closed road circuit. We have a series of street lights which are mounted on the circuit. The circuit doesn't have any other road lighting, so essentially it's completely dark at night except for the headlights of our vehicles and other vehicles that we might put on the circuit. So in this case, we imposed a series of 6 street lights, and they were LED street lights, as you can see here, and we dimmed them by 25%, 50% and 75%, and compared performance compared to 100% of maximum output. And we looked at some younger drivers, and our tasks were for people to detect pedestrians who are walking on the side of the road, as well as a low contrast moving target which moves at a certain speed. And what we found was, this is just showing us, first of all, that's an LMK luminance mapping photo of the actual driving scene. Road luminance was around V category equivalent, so that's at 100%. It was about 1.14 candelas per meter squared, down to 0.25 for the 25% dimming. And the mean lighting at the eye went from 0.95 lux down to 0.31 lux. So how do those changes in light levels, how does that reduction in light levels impact on our ability to see moving targets as well as low contrast pedestrians? And what we found was that he is showing us the moving target reaction time. So a longer reaction time is obviously worse performance. And a shorter one is better because you're reacting to the target more quickly. We found that the L25, the dimming to 25% and 50%, had a significant effect on reaction times compared to the 75 and 100%. So the actual reaction times were 0.4 seconds slower than that of the 100%. And then we looked at the pedestrian detection distances. So this is the detection distances for 100% compared to the dimmed conditions. And we found that the dimmed conditions, these 25 and 50%, were significantly reduced in terms of distance compared to the 75 and the 100%. What we don't know is what impact do these changes in reaction time and changes in detection distances impact overall on safety, and how do they really compare to that of standard street lights that we've already had in place before. And so some of the studies we're doing in the future, I'm just about to commence, is to start to look at comparisons of different LEDs. I think the questions might need to be hidden from me because they're not relevant to me. Essentially, we want to just try and understand how different color temperatures of LED street lights, how they compare to standard street lighting technologies, what have we been prepared to accept previously, and really trying to understand the minimum light levels of LEDs that maintain safety. An interesting issue about LED street lighting it has evoked a lot of controversy among a whole range of different groups, including the American Medical Association, who are warning of the health and safety problems from white LED street lights, the speculation that a short wavelength light emitted from LED street lights might have significant negative effects on human health, including retinal damage as well as changes in circadian rhythms. So in this particular study, we assessed the blue light hazard. We did do the circadian rhythm measurements as well, but I won't discuss that today, of different LED streetlight installations that were in existence around Brisbane, because there are some installations around here that are of different color temperatures. So that's 4000 K and 5900 K, and compared that with the blue light emission or blue light hazard of traditional streetlights and common interior and personal light sources, to really better understand whether those complaints of residents who say that they can't sleep with the LED streetlights and there's concerns about retinal damage, whether they really are valid. And so we use blue weighted irradiance readings at all these road user scenarios, both from the perspective of road users, so cyclists and pedestrians and drivers, as well as residents at the perimeter of their road boundary. And we compared that to the blue light emitted by standard television, computer, laptop and smartphone, and we also included HBS street lighting as well. And you can see that the blue lighted weighted irradiance of the LED street lights was relatively low compared to some of these devices that we use constantly throughout the day. It was significantly lower than those common interior activities. And this, of course, is relevant because screen-based activities tend to be undertaken for fairly long periods of time, whereas the exposure to LED street lights can be relatively transient depending on the road user. So that was an interesting finding, and we're certainly interested in extending that further. In terms of car headlights, high intensity discharge headlights project light further down the road. So there's a lot of interest in them improving safety by increasing visibility because they're illuminating the road for the driver. But the trade-off is that the other road users are exposed to a lot more glare. And there's been a lot of studies to suggest that older drivers have a lot more complaints from light scatter and glare sensitivity from these higher intensity discharge headlights. So that's the issue is, do these headlights make a difference? What's the balance between improving visibility for the driver and reducing glare for the oncoming drivers as well? It's also interesting in terms of these sort of adaptive headlights, which are trying to be adaptive and better illuminate the road environment without causing undue glare. But there hasn't been an awful lot of work on how the sort of human factors work on how that actually improves visibility and reduces glare. These are just some of those adaptive systems. So we have done some studies to look at glare and nighttime driving, looking at how glare impacts on nighttime driving in older adults. And in this study, we looked at 26 older adults with little eye disease, but who self-reported nighttime driving difficulties. And we measured nighttime driving difficulties using the Vision and Night Driving Questionnaire, the NDQ, which was developed. It's a 9-item questionnaire that we developed in our labs with Janessa Kimlin, and it was rash analysed from 283 participants aged 50 and above who complained of nighttime driving difficulties. And this is just showing us of those 9 items, the sort of difficulties that people more commonly express. So blue is no difficulty to red is extreme difficulty. So you can see that people judge that driving in rain in poor weather is the most difficult because it's got the highest level of red. Seeing the road with headlights is also challenging and difficult. The glare at dawn and dusk is, whereas actually judging moving cars and judging the turnoffs was expressed as having much less difficulty. We also assessed these drivers' capacity on the closed road, where we looked at their ability to see signs, road sign, wooden object or animals which were placed at different positions around the course. We looked at detection of pedestrians and low contrast foam hazards, and we looked at performance with and without intermittent glare. So people drove the circuit with glare and without glare, and or without intermittent glare, and we looked at the difference in performance, and the order of these routes was randomized. And we measured visual function using photopic and mesopic visual acuity and contrast sensitivity. We used the Aston holometer as well as the meso test to see whether any of these tests captured the problems at night time better than others. And what we found was that nighttime driving performance was particularly reduced in the presence of glare, particularly for pedestrian detection, which sort of fits in with the fact that we know that pedestrians have 7 times higher fatality rates at night, and of course they're often walking in the presence of glare. So this is showing us the nighttime driving performance, the overall Z score. This is worse performance, so lower values or worse performance for the no glare condition compared to the glare. So without glare, there's better performance, but a lot of that difference is in terms of pedestrian detection. So there was 48% of pedestrians who detected in the no glare. So only about half of these pedestrians were detected in the absence of glare, whereas only 1/10 of those pedestrians were detected in glare. So it's in the presence of glare, it's really hard to detect pedestrians. Even though our drivers actually kind of knew there would be some pedestrians there, they still didn't see them. And we found that mesopic visual function measures predicted nighttime driving performance better than photopic ones. So a photopic high contrast visual acuity, the variance in driving performance predicted by that was relatively low. It was higher than mesopic high contrast visual acuity, where this is better performance and this is better acuity. This is mesopic conditions. And similarly, mesopic measures of motion sensitivity, which we've used in a lot of our studies, was also significantly related to driving performance. And we also found that some of the glare tests, including the Aston halometer and the meso tests, were also better reflecting the nighttime driving performance. But I think there's a fair bit of work required to better assess these tests in larger driving cohorts to inform the development of standard testing protocols. So the last part of my talk is looking at the visibility of vulnerable road users. And by vulnerable road users, we mean typically pedestrians and cyclists. So when we're looking at how we can improve conspicuity or visibility of vulnerable road users, typically we will use clothing incorporating retroreflective materials. And retroreflective materials incorporated in vests are probably one of the most common ways to improve nighttime pedestrian conspicuity. And typically those reflective materials are on the vest. And of course, you can't see me walk as I'm virtual, but essentially if you're walking, your torso tends not to move very much. Whereas if you attach the markers to the movable joints shown here in biological motion, the movement is a lot greater. And in fact, biological motion, the perception of biological motion, has been shown to improve the capacity to detect humans or recognize that something is living as opposed to an inanimate object from a whole series of different studies that date back to Johansson's work in 1973. So basically, Johansson attached light bulbs, little light bulbs, to actors in a darkened room, and he showed that, and a whole series of other researchers have done so after this time, that from just the movement of those light points in the dark can tell us whether someone is a male or whether they're female, just by the movement patterns. We can see whether someone's of slightly heavier stature or a little lighter. We can tell whether someone's nervous or a little relaxed, and also whether they're happy, just very jolly, or whether they're sad. And the translation of this biological motion to road safety is by attaching retroreflective materials to the movable joints, as you saw in the previous slide. These are lit up in the oncoming headlights and create the sensation of a moving creature or a living creature in the environment. So we've undertaken a whole series of nighttime visibility over a few years, where we've looked at a portion of the road circuit, the same one I talked about before, but this time we've tended to use the outside of the road circuit. And we have glare lights at particular positions, either mounted on vehicles or on stands, which simulate oncoming vehicle headlights, and we've got distractor cones. And the person drives around the circuit, and basically they have to call out all road signs, which is not really the whole purpose. It's really a distractor task. But they announce pedestrian and press a touchpad when they first recognize a pedestrian. And we have pedestrians positioned at different points on the circuit, wearing, in the first study that I'm going to discuss, a whole series of different clothing conditions. So in this one, we looked at 10 young and 10 older participants who are drivers, and we looked at 4 clothing conditions. So black is very commonly worn clothing. A lot of people wear black. I'm wearing this sort of dark black, dark navy, which looks pretty black at the moment, and I wear that a fair bit. And I think a lot of people wear black. Not so many people wear white. At night time, a lot of people wear retroreflective vests, but not that many people wear biomotion. So this is the biomotion. This is, in this condition, the amount of reflective material is matched to the amount of reflective material here on the vest. And what we found was that comparing the recognition distance of the pedestrians for those wearing black, white, the vest and the biomotion, remembering that the vest and the biomotion have the same amount of retroreflective material, you can see that older drivers represented in red compared to younger drivers in green actually detected only 58% of the pedestrians and at half of the distances, regardless of the clothing conditions. And you can also see that clothing matters, that the recognition distances were significantly higher for biomotion compared to black, depending on the combination, and 3 times greater than vest. And we were then interested to say, well, okay, we know that. Let's see how well pedestrians estimate their own visibility. So in a completely separate cohort of drivers, 10 young and 10 older, we looked at their capacity. They now, instead of driving the vehicle, an experimenter drives the vehicle, and the pedestrian is actually the actual participant, and they're walking in place wearing different clothes, and they press a button when they think the oncoming vehicle can first detect them as a person. And we compared their data, their estimations, under the same road conditions compared to the data on the previous slide. So those are those pedestrian detection distances combined across a whole range of conditions for black, white, vest and biomotion clothing. This is the actual data, and this is what we see for the participants. So they significantly overestimate their visibility distances in black by a factor of 7 times. So they think they're 7 times more visible than they actually are when they're wearing black, twice and almost 3 times with the vest. But they actually underestimate the capacity for biomotion clothing to actually improve their visibility. So it suggests that we really do need to educate pedestrians better so that they understand that when they're wearing black, like I am today, I won't be seen very well. So I need to make sure I keep well off the road. If I want to make myself visible and I'm going to use retroreflective material, then I should be using biomotion as opposed to a vest. We did some follow-up studies where we looked at the impact of simulated visual impairment and glare on pedestrian detection on young drivers, and we simulated the effects of blur and cataracts in some goggles in a randomized order, and the visual acuity of the blur and the cataract condition were matched, and we looked at the presence and absence of glare lights. And essentially what we found was, this is the percentage of pedestrians recognized in the no glare, that's black, for normal blur and cataract where visual acuity is matched, and glare. So you can see, regardless of the visual condition, the number of pedestrians recognized is always reduced in the glare condition, which is shown in red. And then if we separate it out now in terms of clothing, and this is for the no glare condition, you can see that recognition distances for black are very, very small for normal blur and non-existent for cataracts, better for vest, and only significantly long distances for the biomotion condition. So biomotion clothing maximises pedestrian conspicuity even in the presence of glare. We've also been interested in cycling. We've done a whole heap of studies actually, but on those areas, but I just wanted to jump to cyclists because cyclists are obviously important. They do have high fatality rates at night. And in this study, we looked at younger and older drivers, and we had used different types of clothing where the cyclists cycled on a cycling machine. So they had a real bike, but they cycled in place, so the normal movement of a cyclist and the normal movement of their legs, and they wore either black, a retroreflective vest, or a retroreflective vest and strips on the ankles and knees, a sort of modified biomotion. And what we found was that this is the percentage of cyclists recognized as a function of clothing. Overall, only 70% of cyclists were recognized, remembering that the drivers knew there'd be cyclists, so they are already sort of the heightened awareness of that. The younger drivers recognize cyclists at 3 times longer distances than older drivers. You can see this for percentage recognized and recognition distances, that the younger, who were in black, much more often saw the pedestrians, but also that the distances were longer. But you can see that adding retroreflective strips to the movable joints, the movable legs, made a big difference compared to vest and black. And finally, I just wanted to talk about gaze behavior at night, because we used eye movements to really better understand why it is that biomotion improves pedestrian detection. And in this particular study, we looked at the capacity to detect the walking direction of pedestrians, that is, whether they were walking towards the road or away from the road, as well as being able to detect them. And we compared a retroreflective vest and a biomotion condition. And what we found was, I'll just show you this image here. This is the distance to the pedestrian from our drivers for recognition of walking direction, because of course, if a pedestrian is walking towards the road, they're much more of a risk than a pedestrian walking away from the road. For biomotion, you can see the distances are much longer for recognizing that a pedestrian is present compared to the vest, and also for direction. So when you're wearing biomotion, the driver will better recognize the direction in which you're walking. And we use eye movement analysis to better understand this. So this is showing us the timeline of the driver coming towards the pedestrian, wearing vest or by motion. And this is the pedestrians in the driver's view, and this is the time to the first gaze on the pedestrian. So drivers fixated on the pedestrian wearing the biomotion sooner by a factor of 3 than the vest. So their eyes were attracted to the biomotion sooner, much sooner than that of the vest. It took them much less time to decide that that was a pedestrian, and they could press the button, and they took more than twice as long to recognize a pedestrian wearing a vest compared to the biomotion. So biomotion attracts attention, and it more quickly allows a driver to recognize that a person is present. We've applied this to road worker visibility. So as a result of our work, road workers are now mandated to wear their retroreflective materials in a biomotion configuration. And I'm just going to show you this video, or just show you this video. This is 4 pedestrians, exactly this same 4 pedestrians walking in the day and at night. And you can see that the pedestrian wearing biomotion is very obvious both in the day and the night time. And then they walk back after a moment. Oh, you can't see wearing grey, you can't see the fluorescent vest at night. You can see the actual retroreflective vest, but you can see the biomotion vest. So now road workers have, as a result of our work, changed the requirements for nighttime visibility, as well as traffic controllers and as well as some train workers. And a big aim for us is to try and get people who do cycle or walk at night to also wear reflective materials in the configuration that we know makes them more visible to oncoming vehicles. So to bring all of that together, good vision is important for night driving. We know that visual function is affected under nighttime driving conditions. We know that simulated and true visual impairment reduces nighttime driving performance. But there's very little research on older drivers with visual impairments, and so that's going to be a focus of some of our future work. And we really do need to make sure that we've got evidence-based vision testing protocols for nighttime driving so we can properly represent the nighttime driving environment. We need to take into account that these newer technologies in terms of street lights and headlights are going to impact on driving, so we need to consider how lighting requirements will change in the future. And it's also really important that we try and improve the visibility of our vulnerable road users. Biomotion clothing is highly recommended for those individuals who walk or work at night, who are highly exposed to nighttime driving conditions. And I think it's very clear that we do need education regarding which clothing configurations can best improve conspicuity. And we've got lots of future directions. There's a lot of work we've done, but there's an awful lot of work to do in the future. And we're collaborating with the University of Melbourne as well as the Technical University of Berlin in a series of studies looking at luminance mapping of lighting of modern road systems, trying to better understand higher order visual perception under nighttime driving conditions. And from this data, developing tests that better capture vision-related nighttime driving difficulties and validating those tests against nighttime driving studies. And we also want to really look at better understanding the impact of vision impairment and aging on nighttime driving, because our older drivers population is increasing, more of them will have visual impairment, and many of them need to drive at night in order to conduct their everyday activities. So I'd really like to thank you for your attention, and I would obviously like to acknowledge all my co-workers, because these types of research are very challenging and they need lots of different disciplinary expertise, as lots of ideas and manpower, so a whole range of different collaborators from different disciplines, our research team and our participants, access to the Matt Cotton Driver Training Centre, and of course our funding. And I also wanted to make the point to very finally finish that some of the work that I discussed today was is contained within a review that I wrote for the Ida Mann special issue, which was the last special issue that Dave Elliott edited as part of OPO. And in that review, I looked at nighttime driving, and I reviewed some of the topics that I've discussed this morning. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing some of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. I'm afraid you'll need to imagine the applause of the other 111 people that are watching the presentation. I'm sure they're all doing that at home. So it's my job now just to pass on a few questions that have been popping up. We have 17 questions, so it's a very thought-provoking talk and a great example of how we can apply vision science to address some real world problems. So we'll kick off then with Nicola Logan, no relation, who asks, with more children and young adults wearing multifocal contact lenses or using orthokeratology for myopia control, have you assessed the impact of those types of correction on nighttime driving?
That's a great question. We did in a study with a PhD student, Byung-Sun Chu. He looked at the effect of multifocal contact lenses compared to monovision contact lenses and spectacle corrections. And we found that the multifocal contact lenses had a significant detrimental effect on nighttime driving. So people more commonly complain of problems who are wearing multifocal contact lenses, and we found that that was actually reflected in the driving studies we've done. We haven't looked at ortho-K, and it's a really important question, but I guess we have looked at small amounts of blur, as you saw in one of the studies I discussed before. Even those very small levels of blur of half a diopter do have a big impact on nighttime driving compared to daytime. But in terms of the contact lens corrections, we found the multifocal contact lens correction, we were looking at a group of presbyopes, but I guess the effects would be similar in younger drivers, were the type of correction that had the most detrimental effect on nighttime driving on the closed road circuit.
Great. The second question is, have your group carried out any research on the night driving glasses that are available on your circuit?
Yes, well, we haven't, but that is a really good question. It's certainly quite a controversial one. It depends what sort of nighttime driving glasses you're referring to, but it is our intent to look at that because we do have the capacity to do these type of repeated measures designs which can compare performance wearing a whole series of different types of either blue blocking lenses or different types of tints that are advocated to improve nighttime driving. We haven't done any of those studies, and it's an interesting question that would be really good to follow up in the future, because I think there are a lot of claims about what spectacles can improve nighttime driving, and when we're advising people about those types of corrections, we want to be absolutely sure that there's an evidence base to support that type of advice. So great question.
Great, yeah, very important. One final very interesting practical question, I think. Are you able to test individuals who do not meet the legal driving standards on your circuit?
Yes, we can. So because the circuit is free of other vehicles, we are able to test people who don't meet the driving requirements, which is obviously very useful. We have done some of that in the day. We haven't done much at night. And I think the nighttime driving area is something that's becoming increasingly important to people, but there's really a massive scarcity of good data, and so biology, because of the problems I discussed before, it's very difficult to measure nighttime driving well, and it also involves you getting the participants at night unless you do simulators, and you also have to get your research staff to come and work at night, which is, well, that's what they do because they do nighttime work, but the fact is that it is more challenging. But those are the sort of questions that are really important, and looking at people who don't meet the standards and trying to better understand how they perform is important. We have done quite a lot of studies in the daytime and found that many people who don't meet the visual standards for driving in terms of acuity, for example, still can drive quite safely. And so it looks like from those studies, as well as some of the on-road studies we've done here, and I've done some work with in conjunction with Professor Cynthia Owsley at the University of Alabama in Birmingham in the US, a lot of people who don't meet the visual acuity standards, for example, can still drive relatively safely compared to that of age-matched controls. So the whole issue of what standards we use and whether we do have enough evidence to restrict people from driving is a really important area of research that we're really trying to pursue in the future. So that's another really good question.
Okay, thanks, Joanne. We could listen to you all day, and we've still got more questions coming in, so you've certainly raised a lot of discussion, but unfortunately we'll have to leave it there and not trespass any further on your time. One final time, I'd like to thank you again on behalf of the entire BCOVS organising committee. It was a fabulous way to open the conference. And to everyone else, thank you for showing up this morning and listening to Joanne's talk, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the programme. Our next session is a poster session, and you'll find full details of that in the BCOVS programme. Thank you.
Thank you.